And I just wanted to welcome everybody to the webinar tonight. We're so glad you're able to join. And I wanted to start by thanking the Connecticut Bar Association and the Connecticut Bar Foundation for helping us to put this together. The Connecticut Bar Foundation has just always been amazing with these webinars at sort of providing lots of support. And I just wanted to highlight that throughout the webinar, I'll be putting in words in the chat so that those of you who need CLE credit, continuing legal education credit, can go ahead and figure out how to put those words and use them so that you can register appropriately. And I also wanted to do some housekeeping issues before we begin. We do have a Q&A. I always call it the chat, but I think for participants, it's the Q&A, and we will be monitoring that. And Kaylee is amazing at doing this in a very interactive way. So I'll be looking at the Q&A, and she can look at the Q&A, and we'll be giving her questions. So please keep those questions in the chat coming, because Kaylee is incredibly knowledgeable, and she really answers questions amazingly well. So we'd love to hear your questions and have sort of, as much as we can, have sort of a dialogue. Yeah, and I think I have no further announcements except to say my name is Sheila Hare. I teach at Quinnipiac University School of Law, and I'm just delighted to be able to have Kaylee speak to you tonight. Kaylee Rector, I feel like, is an old friend. I don't think old is quite the right word, but friend certainly is. And she is going to introduce herself in more detail, but she is has been incredibly generous and giving of her time in talking to my students, you know, the Law Women's Society. I think she's going to be talking to the judicial officers and staff. And I just am internally grateful to her, to you, Kaylee, for really getting this conversation going and really taking a broad approach to trauma-informed advocacy, and not only looking at how we as advocates can interact with our clients and the people we work with, but also sort of how we as advocates ourselves sort of take care of ourselves and sort of change the dialogue and the milieu around how we think of trauma. So thank you again for being here and for giving of your time. And with that, I will pass it on to you. And again, just to remind people, please keep your questions coming in the Q&A, because Kaylee is just amazing at answering them. Thanks, Kaylee.
Thank you so much, Sheila. You always give me far kinder words than I feel I warrant, but my deepest gratitude. In addition to what Sheila mentioned about our Q&A box, I hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some open discussion, question answer, if you'd prefer to do it in more of a group context. So really, whatever you're comfortable with is completely okay by us. Before I jump into a quick intro of myself, because that is the least important thing for this evening, I do just want to share a few pieces of information about our conversation this evening and my lens that I'll be talking about this from. So I am an attorney. I've been a practicing attorney for about 8 years now. So all of my experiences with working with trauma survivors has been through that context. I know that a lot of the folks in our audience tonight are attorneys, but I know that a lot of you are not, or maybe in different areas of the legal practice. Perhaps you work for the court system. So I will be giving, anecdotes and examples of experiences I've had, mistakes that I've made throughout my career, and those will obviously be through the lens of an attorney. But I hope that even if I am giving explicit examples of attorney and client, that the underlying ideas and principles will feel relevant and applicable to your work, no matter what area that you're in. The other thing that I wanted to just share is that this is a tough topic, right? We're going to be talking about trauma that our clients and people that we serve go through, but we're also going to be talking about our own trauma that we bring to the work, that we came into this work with, and also trauma that we might take on simply by having exposure to what the people that we serve have gone through themselves. So it's a tough topic, and I very much respect that people might bring some of their own experiences into this conversation. So with that in mind, please do whatever you need to do this evening to care for yourself. Please feel free to, I think the cameras are off by default, but I always say feel free to turn your cameras off or on, whatever makes you more comfortable. Grab a cozy blanket, some, nice beverage, anything that's going to make this a comfortable environment for you. And of course, take care as we go on and talk about various topics. If there's ever something that is just not in your emotional wheelhouse tonight, please feel free to hop off, hop back on, whatever works for you. I understand that some of this may feel very close to home, depending on what our own experiences have been, both in our own lives and in our professional lives. And so just want to be mindful of that as we open the conversation. So very briefly about myself, I am an immigration attorney for the past 6 years now. Gosh, I mess up the math every time I do this because it keeps getting longer. I focused exclusively on immigration work, specifically humanitarian immigration, so applications like asylum and victim-based forms of immigration status. But my entire career has really been dedicated to working with vulnerable populations, whether it was abused and neglected children or domestic violence survivors. That has always been kind of my calling. So I have some experience outside of immigration with family law and child welfare law, specifically in New York. I am licensed both in Connecticut and New York, but currently practicing at Catholic Charities Community Services in the city, doing immigration and a whole variety of different things, both my own practice and supervising staff and pro bono attorneys. So to get our conversation started, I would love to hear a little bit about your experiences. That's what I'm more interested in. So I'm not sure if anybody has used Mentimeter before, but it's a phenomenal tool I was just introduced to by some colleagues in New York that I find is really great for facilitating open discussion on a virtual platform, which can often be a little challenging. So we're going to be using Mentimeter this evening to interact with each other and share our thoughts, share our experiences. So I'm going to ask everybody at this moment if you can either grab your cell phone or open up a browser on your computer and navigate to menti.com. You'll see that address at the bottom, menti.com. And when you get to that website, you're going to be asked to type in a code. And if you can type in the code 559278888, that should bring you to our questions that we're going to be moving through this evening. And anytime that we are going to be using Menti, I'll have this link and this code back up on the screen, but feel free to jot it down if that's going to be helpful for you. So with that in mind, I'll give it maybe just a minute for everybody to get over to Menti. And I did navigate away from our slides, but if you can see up at the top here, we still have the link and then our code 55927888. And once you get here, you should be prompted with a screen that will allow you to enter in responses to the question that shows up on our screen. So our first question tonight is, in your experience, what are some of the greatest challenges in providing direct services to trauma survivors? And this can include external challenges, organizational challenges, but it can also include internal challenges like dealing with mental health issues and secondary stress. And I should also add that all the responses are anonymized, so neither I nor you will know who is writing them. So we already have a few that have come in. So hearing a potential client share their trauma, empathizing with them, but then having to tell them that there's nothing that you can do for them is very difficult, absolutely. Gaining trust, building rapport, especially when working with young people and children. Secondary trauma, we're lucky to have an in-house therapist. Wow, that's an incredible setup. I'm very envious of whoever that is, but still don't know how people who don't have that support do it. Understood. Difficulty with memory and recall, not being able to provide people with the help that they need, secondary stress, internalizing that trauma, communication, understanding, trust, language barrier, inability to stop due to emergencies and short staff. Yes, absolutely. Lack of safe housing and other resources for sure. Thank you so much for everybody who shared. And my hope too is that by doing this, we can see that we are very much not alone in the things that we experience, the things that we love about this work, but the things that make this work incredibly, incredibly difficult. So our next question is, have you ever struggled with the impact of providing direct services to trauma survivors? So for instance, burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, any kind of work-related stress in the many ways that it manifests? Yes, a resounding yes. Absolutely. Oh, yes, very much so. I had a feeling we might see a few of these responses. And for what it's worth, if I was typing an answer in, I would also have a absolutely emphatically yes, 100 times over. Secondary trauma, 100. By the way, if anybody has not struggled, that is completely okay too. I don't want you to feel left out. That means you have wonderful, wonderful resilience factors, and I would very much love to hear any tips and tricks that you have. So please don't feel left out if this doesn't resonate with your experience. So unsurprisingly, it sounds like a lot of us have been here, right? So my next question is, knowing this, that we all are struggling and have been there, do you feel like you currently receive what you need to successfully support the clients that you serve, but also take care of yourself, take care of your colleagues, and take care of your clients? Yes. Oh, this is great. So a couple no's, couple I'm not sure's. But so far, most people are saying yes, which is wonderful. We're going to be talking a lot tonight, not only about taking care of ourselves, but how we can really build organizational resilience. And especially for those of us who are in positions of leadership and supervising other staff, what we have responsibility and obligations to do to help support our colleagues and the people that we supervise. So we've got a good mix here, and I'm really happy to see that a lot of you feel like you get that support and get those tools that you need. And then if you are comfortable, particularly perhaps those of you who said that you don't get those supports, or maybe for those of you who do, you can share what works and what helps. But if you're willing to elaborate on that prior response at all, I'd love to hear a little bit about why you answered the way that you did. If there's something particular that you wish that your organization or that your employer was able to offer, perhaps something that's worked really well in the past. And if not, that's okay too. So externally, more community resources. Yeah, I definitely can empathize with that. Even in a place as resource rich as New York City, I think that oftentimes I see nonprofits, especially, we struggle to communicate with one another and have a really good system for knowing what resources are in place to avoid duplicating efforts and be able to support one another's work. Wonderful supervisors that help prevent burnout and advocate for self-care. That makes such a difference. Learning to walk away when necessary. Debriefs. Love a debrief. Big fan of a debrief. And we'll talk about that too. Been in the field since 2017 and made sure to find the things that you were lacking. That's wonderful. Working with students, I could not agree more. Working with Sheila and her students is absolutely one of my favorite things to do. I agree with you that they are really, this new generation is very open to discussing a lot of these topics. And every time I talk to law students, it just gives me a lot of hope for the future of our profession. So needing answers to housing and more case management, again, just like that lack of resources or being able to navigate the existing resources and find them. And I know that I struggle with easy paths. Like once I identify a place that my client might be able to receive supportive services, how do I get them those services, and is there capacity? Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of these answers, everyone. So I might skip this one. I mean, if anybody wants to share a response, you're more than welcome to, but I think you all read my mind a little bit and people started to share a little in response to what this question asks. So what tools would be helpful that you don't get? So I'll give it a minute just in case anybody has anything that they want to add beyond what was offered in the prior slide. But, oh, we do have some asking direct questions. I like that. I honestly, candidly, I struggle with that. I am actively working on being a more direct communicator. So I appreciate that point. Anybody else want to share? And if not, that is completely okay. All right. So thank you everybody so much for sharing all of that. Again, I hope that that gave you a sense of not being alone in this, and that everybody who's here tonight, we've all been through a lot of the same struggles, and we come to this with a lot of the same questions and frustrations, but also a lot of the same hope that we might be able to seek really meaningful support from one another and the places that we work. So with that in mind, I'm hoping that this evening we can cover three main topics. First, I want to start by defining trauma so that we have a shared understanding of what it is that we mean when we refer to trauma. And I also want to talk briefly about the neurobiology of trauma and how it impacts the way that our brains operate. I just saw our first question, Carla, will the material be shared with us? Absolutely. I'm happy to share these slides with Stacy and with Sheila and have those circulated after the presentation for sure. So once we finish defining trauma and talking a little bit about how it impacts our brain, you're very welcome, Carla. We're next going to talk about trauma and the relationship that we have as service providers with survivors, with clients that we serve, and how we can incorporate tenets of trauma-informed care into that relationship to make it more meaningful, more safe, and encourage more engagement from the people that we're working with. And finally, last but very much not least, we're going to talk about combating work-related stress. And when I say work-related stress, I'm going to use that as a catch-all term this evening to encompass a lot of different forms of stress and how it might manifest. So everything from burnout to empathy fatigue, to vicarious trauma, secondary stress, and moral injury. We'll talk a little bit about some of those differences later on, but I just want to be clear that when I'm saying that, I'm intending that to include and encompass a variety of different experiences. And when we use the term community care, we had this in one of the questions before on Menti. I actually adopted this candidly from a presentation I did last year. We had some questions that were posed to the audience before we started, sort of like a pre-session survey. And somebody very thoughtfully pointed out that they wanted to move away from the term self-care and move towards more of a community care model. And that resonated so deeply with me that I am actively trying to train self-care out of my vocabulary and replace it with this concept of community care, because I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly right, that self-care in a vacuum can only go so far. If we are working within systems and within organizations and within supervision structures that are not supportive, that are not trauma-informed, there's only going to be so much that we can do. And so to truly, truly create a trauma-informed and resilient practice, whatever your practice area might be, it has to be a top-down, bottom-up, side-to-side approach. And so that's where I come to that concept of community care. So starting with our definition of trauma, there are a lot out there, I will say this, but the one that we're going to be working with tonight comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. And SAMHSA defines trauma as an event, a series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and has lasting adverse effects on that individual's functioning and mental, physical, emotional, social, or spiritual well-being. And there's two pieces of that definition that I want to highlight. The first is that this is about how something is experienced by an individual. So that means that trauma is inherently subjective. We can have the same event or series of events or circumstances occur to two different people, and one of them might experience it as traumatic and the other might not. And that can be for a variety of factors. It could be, backgrounds, cultural differences, resilience factors. But that's important for us to remember, because we never want to assume that something is or isn't traumatic. And I am guilty of this 100%. I mentioned before, I do asylum work. That means I hear some pretty horrific things that my clients have been through. And I think it's kind of human nature to, if I'm doing a day of consults and I have 4 consults in a row where somebody experienced horrific physical torture and persecution. And then my 5th consult of the day is somebody who was able to escape from home country before the danger became physical. And so instead, they suffered from, perhaps months of very, very serious death threats, but luckily were able to leave before anything happened to them physically. I have absolutely fallen into the trap of thinking, oh, this isn't so bad, especially compared to what I just heard. And I constantly have to remind myself and check myself that it's not about the what, it's the how this person in front of me, how they experienced it. And we also want to make sure that we're not assuming that something is traumatic, right? People have very, very high resilience factors. And that's one of the most amazing things about this work, is seeing the strength of the human spirit. And so I want to make sure that we're never concluding that something was traumatic for somebody. But that being said, I think the takeaway for tonight is that it's not a bad idea to perhaps operate from the assumption that somebody has gone through something traumatic, even if you might not know explicit details about their history. And part of the reason for that is that trauma is incredibly prevalent. So it's estimated that about 70% of the adults in the United States have experienced trauma in some form or another at a point in their lives. And when we think about the various places that trauma can stem from, that's actually not that surprising, those numbers. So, childhood abuse and neglect, war and other forms of violence, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, Accidents and natural disasters, medical interventions can be traumatic. Witnessing acts of violence, even if you weren't subjected to it yourself. Grief and loss can be traumatic. And of course, vicarious trauma for people who are working directly with with trauma survivors can also experience that trauma, even if they haven't personally experienced any traumatic events themselves, just that exposure to it. And it's also important to remember that trauma never occurs in a vacuum. So it occurs within all of the various intersecting identities that somebody might have, their personal, social, political context of their lives, their race, class, ability, gender, identity, expression, first language. All of these things are going to impact how somebody experiences something. And I want to just acknowledge something that just came into the chat that I think is really important and insightful. So David mentioned trauma is not necessarily bad, depending on how it's framed. A lot of growth is post-traumatic, and the problems arise in the meanings that we give to events. So just commenting on that. And David, I am so grateful for that, because I agree wholeheartedly with that statement. Surely a traumatic event itself is very difficult, but also from that can come, as you exactly point out, a tremendous amount of strength and resilience and growth. And that's actually a concept that we'll end with tonight, this concept of vicarious resilience, which is sort of the flip side of the coin to vicarious trauma. So when we're talking about trauma not occurring in a vacuum, I want to go back to that definition we were looking at a slide before. So it talked about how trauma has these wide-reaching impacts on, your personal, social, religious, all these different parts of your life. It has these really wide-reaching effects. And so that means that somebody who's experienced trauma is going to have it permeate through all these different parts of their lives. It's going to be very complex in the way that it shows up. And that means that there's going to need to be a very complex and thoughtful response to be able to mindfully and thoughtfully respond to all of those complex impacts that that traumatic event had. So I said before that we'll talk about the neurobiology of trauma. Massive disclaimer, as I am an attorney, I can't talk about this as a medical professional. I will do my best, and I do think this is an important part of the discussion. I know for me, this was kind of a light bulb moment when I first started learning about the actual changes that happen in the way that our brain functions after we go through a trauma. So I do think it's important for us to have this baseline knowledge, both for our clients and for ourselves. Candidly, I think that I've found this information very helpful in my personal life, not just my professional life. But that being said, I cannot talk about this as eloquently as those who are medical professionals can. And I would encourage folks, if this interests you, there are some people out there who do an amazing job with this material. Dr. Jim Hopper, Hopper in particular, is an absolute genius when it comes to talking about trauma and the brain. If you Google him, he's got a bunch of lectures that are available for free on YouTube. I will just flag that Dr. Hopper does talk a lot about trauma as it relates to sexual violence. So just in case that's a sensitive topic for anybody. So going back to our brain that we have here. So essentially we have different parts of our brain, and each part is responsible for different types of functioning. And we have, the way that our brain operates normally, different parts interact with each other and take care of different things. And we see some of those examples here. When we undergo a traumatic event where our brain interprets that we are in danger, regardless of whether objectively we are or not, the subjective perception of our brain is we are in danger. Our brain kicks into this fear circuitry that essentially overrides the normal, and I'm going to use normal with quotes. I don't love that term, but just for purposes of our discussion, our baseline perhaps is a better word, our baseline operating of our brain, and it overrides that. So, for example, our amygdala, which is normally responsible for emotional processing, will start sending distress signals to our hypothalamus, which is responsible for hormones. Our hypothalamus will then flood our body with stress hormones like adrenaline to communicate to our nervous system that there's danger and we need to be ready to flee at a moment's notice. Another area that's impacted is our hippocampus, which is responsible for the processing and storage of memories. So a traumatic memory is often not stored with the same level of detail that a normal or non-traumatic memory would be. Instead, traumatic memories are often very emotionally charged and also very sensory charged. So the things that are stored are often the very strong emotions that somebody was feeling, or maybe the senses that they were engaging in that moment, perhaps smell, sound, or touch. And although the purpose of this fear circuitry is at its core a survival instinct, right? It was developed for us as a species to stay alive when our ancestors, our caveman ancestors were facing a predator. We had to stay alive, we had to move, we had to respond quickly, otherwise we would die. So the purpose of this fear circuitry is to keep us alive by basically bypassing any parts of our brain that are not absolutely necessary in that moment to promote survival. Unfortunately, the flip side of this is that we aren't able to access a lot of that high functioning that we normally have available to us, like complex emotional processing, analytical thinking, again, with the memories, the really detail-rich memory processing. All of that is not available in the same way that it typically is. So I want to have a switch back over to Menti as we engage in a little bit of an exercise. So I want everybody to carefully and mindfully, because I don't know what this would bring up for folks. So just, do whatever you're comfortable with. And if this brings up a memory that does not work for you, then feel free to shut this down and not engage. But if you can, think of a time when you felt scared or that you could be in danger of some sort. So maybe it was, walking down a dark street at night, or maybe narrowly avoiding a fender bender on the highway. I really want you to try as best as you can to put yourself back into that moment, what your body was feeling, what your emotions were, and really, really try to go back there. And we're going to go through a few questions to sort of reflect on what was happening in that moment. So what physical changes do you remember happening is our first question. We see somebody already wrote freeze. Tensing, racing heart, yep. Hot and sweaty. Stomach problems, shaking, chest pain, inability to speak. Absolutely. Hard to breathe. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. And then my next question is, what emotions do you remember feeling, if any? And I say if any, because sometimes folks have said that they didn't feel anything at all. It's almost like a numbness. So we see anxious, worry, panic, guilt, fear, numbness, right? So I mentioned that before. Sometimes people just have a void of emotions. Insecure, intense fear. It's really, really strong and powerful words. So next, which details stick out to you the most? What are the things that you feel like you can concretely remember? Whether it was a sound, something visual, something that you could smell, something somebody said to you, smell, yep. And I should also add, by the way, you can share only what you're comfortable with. You don't have to share anything that would disclose what the particular memory is. Urge to run, what I wore, the feeling of my heart racing, sounds, gasping, visual memories, yep. Okay. And then contrastly, which details are hard to remember? Where are the things that are fuzzy when you try to call up this memory? What happened afterwards? Yep. Sounds hard to remember. And for the person who wrote what happened afterwards, I also wonder, what was it that perhaps was able to bring you back down from that heightened state? How I felt prior or after, details are lost. What happened just before? So we're almost having this like bookmark, like right before and right after. We kind of lose that. How I got through it, time, my feelings, what I was doing. Absolutely. And my last question, and this is kind of hearkening to what I just asked the person who first mentioned after what happened after, what helped you return to a less heightened state after that dangerous moment? So when was it that you finally started to feel like you were coming back down to earth? And what, if anything, did you identify that helped you get there? Deep breaths. Breathing breathing exercises are always very helpful. Quiet time with spouse. So I assume that is a trusted, safe person. So that's an interesting point, being with safe people in a safe space. When I had my emotional support system, physically removing myself from the location, crying and time, absolutely. Sleep as well, right? That exhaustion afterwards, physically removing themselves again. Yep. So I want to thank everybody for such honest answers, and I want to just take a little breath, again, because I understand that this might have brought up difficult memories for folks. So reflecting on some of your phenomenal responses here, thinking about those physical changes in your body, those weren't things that you were consciously telling your body to do. You weren't consciously telling yourself to breathe harder, your heart to race, or to start sweating. These were things that happened automatically, right? And then those blanks, those pieces that you were missing, it's a pretty visceral thing. And when you really start thinking about it, like, wow, no, I had like a chunk of time that I really just lost. I really just don't have access to. And imagine if one of my questions was, think about that chunk of time that you lost and tell me what happened there, right? How difficult and frustrating that would be. And then all the responses that we have up on the screen now, returning to that less heightened state. So a couple of the themes that I see here, being in safe spaces, including if that meant leaving the dangerous space and finding another safe space, and also safe people, that made a difference. So that human connection, and then things that bring us back into our body. So that deep breathing, that exercise, that crying, that sleep, whatever that release might be to just let our bodies relax and bring us back into our physical selves, that also helps. And these are important things to keep in mind, because these are exactly the types of tricks that you can use when you're working with somebody who perhaps is being triggered or perhaps is having some sort of trauma response. You can provide them with physical human connection. You can help them go back into their bodies by using grounding exercises and deep breathing. So reflecting on your own experiences can be incredibly insightful and helpful when you're worrying and trying to figure out how to help somebody work through a moment of their own. So going back to our slides, I know folks probably have heard of fight, flight, freeze. And so thinking about even some of the responses we just talked about, a lot of times trauma responses, stress responses can fall into one of these categories. And there's also occasionally you'll see a fourth F, fawn. And these are just our evolutionary survival instincts. Again, what we developed as a species to stay alive. And I want us to think about these in kind of the broadest terms possible. So of course, fight can physically mean somebody, fighting and being aggressive, but it can also be emotional aggressiveness, right? So if you have a client that you're working with who is very, very frustrated and very angry and very impatient, maybe that's somebody who's just a difficult personality or having a tough day, but it's possible that it might actually be a trauma response, right? And so thinking about how people's responses might actually fall into one of these categories can help us realize that what's going on for somebody is not just, what is coming across, right? It's not just them being aggressive or being, frustrated or whatever the outward result of that response is. It's thinking about what's going on internally for them that might be causing it. And when we thought about our own experiences in that exercise before, and how little control we had over the things that were happening in our body, the things that we may not have remembered, that's important to remember too, because when somebody is having a trauma response or a stress response, they very rarely have control, or at least the same level of control that they typically would, over their emotions, over their physical body, and therefore they shouldn't be to blame for their instinctive responses. And I want to just draw a quick distinction here. This isn't to say that therefore we should accept and tolerate abusive behavior or rude behavior. It is possible that somebody who's experiencing a trauma and a traumatic response can react in a way that is very not okay. And we can say that is not okay for you to talk to us that way. A trauma-informed response, instead of us assuming that this is somebody who is, intentionally being aggressive or not a good person, a trauma-informed response simply asks us to take a step back and realize what might be going on for them internally, and still be able to draw a healthy boundary and take care of ourselves. So I mentioned earlier that, as an attorney, a lot of the way that I approach this is from how trauma shows up in my work, which is often a legal case. So I'm going to highlight a few things that are most relevant for me as an attorney when I think about how trauma shows up when I'm working with a client in a legal system. But again, I hope that a lot of these examples might feel relevant and transferable no matter what your line of work is. So we see a few different things up on the screen here, and the 4 categories: memory, engagement, credibility, and relationship. And just looking through some of these, right? We all know that there are difficult clients, and we all know that part of this work is getting frustrated with clients. We are human, they are human. That happens, that is normal. And I also don't want to say that difficult personalities don't exist. That is also a thing, and personality clashes exist. But looking at this list, right, a lot of these things that we see up on the screen are characteristics or responses that often are associated with difficult clients, right? People who don't respond to you when you're reaching out to get information or to follow up on services, people who don't come to meetings or who are late to meetings, people who are hostile or have difficulty opening up, or maybe don't engage with the process, or if you talk about doing something, they don't follow through. These are things that are very easy to characterize as just like, oh, that client drives me crazy. But a trauma-informed approach is pausing and putting the brakes on for ourselves and taking a step back and saying, hey, is there something else going on here? And I am the first person to throw myself under the bus, because all of this, to be clear, is very much a journey and not a destination. I am actively every single day trying to improve my practice as a trauma-informed lawyer. And I am every single day continuing to make mistakes, and I'll continue to make mistakes, and that's okay. So I am happy to share some of those, just to make it clear, I'm not on any high horse to say that I know, everything and I handle every situation perfectly. Couldn't be further from the truth. And I think, honestly, one of the examples that always comes to mind when we talk about this, right, and how we differentiate from like a difficult client and a client who's been through a trauma, and how we respond. I think back to one of the first asylum cases that I ever did, and I had this wonderful, wonderful woman that I was working with. She was so engaged in the process. We had a great rapport. She was really, really a teammate, right? We were working together to put together evidence, to put together her declaration. And for anybody who's ever worked on an asylum case, that in immigration court, particularly, it's rather intense. Towards the end of the process, a couple weeks before the hearing, you have this big evidence deadline where you have to file all of your evidence, which often is 600, 700 pages plus a legal brief. It's quite a lift. So we were coming up on that deadline, and that was my first time doing it. I was terrified, stressed out as all hell, because I just had so many things that I needed to do. And in the last couple of meetings that we had to, finalize details in my client statement, she didn't show up. She didn't show up to one meeting, and then I think a second one she didn't show up to either, which was super, super out of character for her. She was never late. She always communicated if something came up. So the first time that she didn't show up, I texted her, I followed up. We had a preset meeting because we were meeting regularly kind of leading up to this deadline. I didn't hear from her, and then she didn't show up to the second meeting. And I started to panic, because all that I could focus on was, oh my God, we need to finish our statement. And then once we finish our statement, I need to cross-check that with the statements that we just got from her brother in home country. And then I need to add that all to our evidence package. And I need to update my brief and finish writing my brief. And then I need to draft the country conditions index, and just going down, the spiral of all of the things that I had to take care of before this deadline, and how her not showing up to this meeting was totally throwing off that timeline. And then I proceeded to follow up with her and follow up with her and follow up with her, texting, hey, client, just want to check in, see how you're doing. Hey, client, we missed that meeting. Hey, client, can we reschedule our meeting? Hey, client, do you remember that big evidence deadline that we have, and we still have to finish your statement? And so she resurfaced maybe, a week or so after this, and immediately, apologized and said, remember the nightmares that I was telling you that I was having about my grandfather's death? Well, it was the anniversary of his death last week, and I was having the nightmares like nonstop every night. I couldn't sleep. I was exhausted during the day, and I didn't have it in me emotionally to do the things, to talk about the things I knew we were going to have to talk about in the meeting. And I immediately felt like an idiot. because of the many dates that she wasn't sure of. See note before about traumatic memories. One of the dates that she knew without a shadow of a doubt was the date that her grandfather died. We had his death certificate. It was a major, major part of her story and what had happened to her and the persecution that underlied her asylum claim. And it was all over our evidence filing. It was all over her declaration. We had the death certificate. And if I had had more trauma-informed tools available to me, if I knew then what I know now, excuse me, I could have thrown the brakes on, hopefully, and realized, this is super out of character for her. Like, what is going on here? Because this is not her normal approach to things. And I might have been able to, I think I would have been able to put 2 and 2 together, right? And so instead of adding, because I am sure that I added to her anxiety and her stress by, my constant texting, and I undoubtedly, probably caused some level of harm as a result. So instead of doing that, I could have checked in with her. I could have asked how she was doing. Maybe she would have felt comfortable sharing with me what was going on. I could have helped facilitate her reaching out to the therapist that we had just gotten her in touch with to maybe schedule a session. I could have asked her, is there some other way that is safer for us to engage in the discussions that we have? Maybe we can do it by email. Would that feel less emotionally taxing for you? I could have responded in a way that caused less harm. And that's really what this comes down to. And that's why I want to be very clear that I screw this up all the time. And you will too, and that's okay. What matters is that we start recognizing this so that in these moments over time, we can start to stop ourselves and throw on those brakes. And Alicia, thank you so much for sharing that you feel this is important to remember. I agree wholeheartedly. And I think about this client often. And honestly, that was like right when I was starting to learn about trauma. And luckily, she was a very gracious woman and was able to forgive my misstep there. And we went on to thankfully win her case. But I do think of that often, and it is definitely a motivator to try to maintain that trauma-informed lens from there on out. So let's take a quick 5-minute break before we go on to our next section, which is talking about trauma-informed care and how we can incorporate that actively into our relationships with our clients. So it's 6:43 right now. So let's come back. You're testing my math skills here, which are limited as an attorney, but 6:48, if I'm not mistaken, should be 5 minutes. So get up, stretch your legs, grab a drink of water, and we'll see you back in 5 minutes. All right, I hope everybody was able to get a little bit of a break in, and we're going to start back up. And I wanted to just, I was in the middle of responding to David, who made a good point in the chat that, thinking about whether validation can sometimes actually make trauma worse. So David mentioned thinking about a child's fear of dogs. And unless a child has actually been attacked by a dog, and then you know that it comes from the parents, right? So are we projecting things onto people, or perhaps bringing it to the forefront when it's something that they don't want to have at the forefront? And I totally hear that point. And I think I struggle with that. I struggle with that professionally, personally. Like, where does trauma live in the hierarchy of things? We want to have it at the front of our minds. We're being trauma informed, and we're remembering that could be a factor in any of our interactions with somebody. But also, so this person is a whole individual outside of and beyond whatever trauma they may have experienced. And so kind of constantly bringing it back to trauma, does that sort of overly focus on that and not focus enough on other aspects of who they are and what their experiences have been and their resilience factors? So I definitely hear that. And I think that it's a balance. And I think it's also open communication, right? Especially if you know somebody has been through something traumatic, or they are responding in a way that indicates fear or anxiety or worry, just asking them like, hey, like what's going on for you right now? I'm noticing this. I could be totally off, but what's happening internally for you right now? So I can't remember who had mentioned or what question it was in response to the direct communication. I think it might have been what tools would be helpful. Somebody mentioned direct questions or asking direct questions. And I think that's a perfect example of it. So David, thank you so much. I really appreciate that insight. So this is where we land, right? A trauma-informed perspective asks not what is wrong with you, going back to my client, not what is wrong with you, client, for not showing up to this meeting, but what happened? What's going on for you right now that you aren't showing up, which is very out of character for you? And this term trauma-informed was coined in the early 2000s by these two PhD researchers, my goodness, it is the end of the day, who were trying to come up with a way of approaching service providing that recognizes how widespread trauma is and how impactful and wide-reaching its impacts are, as we talked about before, but also seeking to reduce the rate of re-traumatization in the course of providing services. And Karen, I just saw that you asked about the attendance survey. I apologize. I'm not sure if you can clarify what you're referring to, if that had to do with the CLE codes, or if you were referring to some of the mentee questions. We'd be happy to respond to that more fully. My apologies for not following what we were referring to there. So another really great tool from SAMHSA is the 4 R's. And this goes back to what I mentioned before about community care and really thinking about, from an organizational top-down perspective, how we can create trauma-informed structures where we work so that is supportive for us and also the people that we serve. So SAMHSA posits that trauma-informed care is grounded in these 4 assumptions, collectively known as the 4 R's. So a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed is going to first realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, but also families, staff, and others involved in the system, which is one of my favorite parts of this. Responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, right? So this is not just a question of one-on-one client interaction between service provider and the person receiving the services. This is thinking about what policies do we have in place as an organization to promote trauma-informed care for the people we serve, but also for our people, right? And then last, seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. So why does all of this matter? First and foremost, if we have trauma-informed environments where we're providing services, that means that the people receiving those services are going to feel safer and more trust in those of us who are giving those services to them. They are going to be more engaged in that process. And from my perspective, from an attorney perspective, that's critical, right? If I'm representing an asylum seeker, I can only do so much if they don't tell me, if they don't feel comfortable and safe telling me what happened to them. All my knowledge of asylum law does nothing if I cannot tell the judge what happened to this specific person and why that meets the definition of asylum. Second, speaking of judges, it's going to make us more effective advocates. So when I file those gigantic evidence packages that I talked about before for asylum, one of the sections I always include is a section of a variety of resources and scholarly articles specifically on trauma and how it impacts memory. And I do that because for asylum, one of the things that the judge has to determine is whether my client is credible. And there's a whole list of reasons that the law sets it up to make it very easy to find people not credible in the asylum process, however unfair that is. And so I want to educate my adjudicator because I understand that my client may outwardly display things that are viewed as, not credible the way that our legal system anticipates a credible witness might be. So, telling stories in a linear, clear fashion, being able to remember lots of details about those stories and answer questions directly about what happened to them, making eye contact, having appropriate emotional responses to things that they're talking about. All of those, when we think back to how trauma impacts our brain, our emotional regulation, our analytical thinking, our memory storage, all of that functionality is not going to be as available as it typically would be when somebody particularly is recalling a traumatic event. And so I, as an advocate, want to be able to explain to my adjudicator through evidence that I can argue in court and say, this is why when you see my client laughing as they talk about being threatened, it doesn't mean that they're lying. That's actually a very understandable response based on the way that their brain is responding to recalling a traumatic situation. And candidly, I would argue makes them more credible because that right there, Your Honor, Exhibit A is a trauma response. So we're going to be able to advocate for our clients, whether it's with adjudicators in a legal system or with other people or other systems that they might be interacting with. We can advocate for them and contextualize things that might be misunderstood. And last but not least, it's going to mean that we can stay in this work as long as possible because burnout is a real thing. I have been there. I've struggled with it. I will probably continue to struggle with it. I've seen colleagues struggle with it. I've seen people leave the profession entirely because of it. I was just having a conversation earlier today with a really wonderful, passionate advocate who said that they are not sure that direct services is sustainable for them anymore in the long term, as much as they love it and they love the connection that they have with their clients. And that breaks my heart because that is one less amazing, zealous advocate in this space that needs them so desperately, who cannot go on because of the way that our systems are set up in a way that is not sustainable for her. So knowing how this impacts not just our clients, but impacts us as service providers is going to mean that we can take care of ourselves, of our colleagues, of our people in a better way, in a more supportive way that allows us to stay in this work as long as we want. So when we think about how to develop a trauma-informed relationship with the people that we serve, I want to look at the 6 concepts or principles of trauma-informed care, which again come from SAMHSA. If you'll notice a theme, I'm a big fan of their materials. So we see them here on the screen, and then at the center is this car, and that's by design. This is a metaphor that I use and love. I literally use it when I'm explaining to clients how I view our relationship. So when we think about trauma, it is inherently a loss of control, right? You don't have control over the thing that is happening to you. You don't often have control over how your body is responding, as we explored earlier. So being trauma informed is really all about putting our client back in control, giving that control back to our client whenever possible, and even in the smallest ways possible, putting our client in the driver's seat, as I like to say. So I literally explain to people, this is how I see our relationship. We are in a car together. You are in the driver's seat. I'm over on the passenger side. You let me know where you want to go, what our destination is going to be ideally. I will then take that information, plug it into my cell phone because I have absolutely no sense of direction whatsoever. And I will then be able to tell you the 3 routes that my iPhone spits out that we can take. And I'll tell you which is the longer one, which one avoids the highways, which is the scenic route. But then at the end of the day, you are the one who has control over the gas, the brake, the wheel, to decide which of those routes we're going to take to get to that destination. You also have control over whether we pull over and take a pit stop and take a break. You also have control over whether you pull over and kick me out of the car at any point. I am here to give you the information and the tools that you need to then make the best decisions for yourself to get to hopefully that end destination, whatever it may be. Because at the end of the day, you are the only person who can make those decisions for you. I'm not in your life. This is your life that's being impacted by it. So I am just here in the passenger seat to help guide you there and make the best decisions for yourself. And I think as attorneys in particular, this is a really unique concept of being a trauma-informed attorney, because we talked about how being trauma-informed is inherently about minimizing re-traumatization. And in a lot of professions, so for example, a therapist, right? They can work with somebody for years and years and years and never go back and have them relive the underlying trauma if they don't want to, right? They could focus on how is it impacting you today? What are some coping tools that we can work on to help you deal with it in the future? So theoretically, you could be in therapy for years and never actually talk about the thing that happened, the traumatic event, and just talk about the here and now and the future. In contrast, for attorneys, particularly if the traumatic event is related at all to the legal relief that the client is coming to you for help with, we often don't have a choice, right? For me, again, asylum, I do not have a choice. If somebody comes to me and says, I want to apply for asylum, I am scared to go back to my home country, that means they are going to have to tell me in excruciating detail all of the absolute worst moments of their lives, not only once, not only twice, but multiple times over and over. They're going to have me ask them questions multiple times to elicit more and more details and perhaps go into memories that they haven't discussed with anybody else in their lives. We're going to have to write down all of that and have them review it before signing it. We're then going to have to share that with colleagues as we practice and prepare for the hearing so that they can pretend to be the government attorney and then pretend to cross-examine them ruthlessly so they're prepared for that. And then on the day of the hearing, we're going to have to share that story with experts so that they can provide their testimony to support the case and be successful. And then at the actual hearing, they're going to have to talk possibly for hours, testifying on direct and cross-examination, being subject to questions by the government attorney, by the judge, and of course by me about, again, the worst experience of their lives. So that is re-traumatizing. I don't even know how many times over, but I can't do the thing that they're asking without that. So what does that mean for me as an attorney? How can I balance both of those needs at the same time? How can I be a zealous advocate and strongly pursue the relief that my client wants while also trying to minimize re-traumatization? And I think these 6 principles can help with that. And I don't think it's always possible to avoid re-traumatization in total, but maybe we can minimize it a little bit by incorporating these. So we're going to move through each of these principles and apply them to our fictional client. Her name is Mercedes. So we have a little bit of information about Mercedes up on the screen. So she was referred to us, our fictional, we'll say law office, again, because that's my point of reference, by a domestic violence advocate. She had disclosed that she was living with her partner, but in April of last year, there was a physical altercation where her partner slapped her, broke some of her belongings. At that point, Mercedes went to a friend's house for a while, but is now back in the apartment with her partner. She's indicated that this has happened before, but didn't have a lot of details about other incidents. The only one she was sure about and date-wise was in April. There was also some disclosure about the fact that the partner is withholding Mercedes' passport, and there might be some forced work happening in the home adjacent to that. And then what we know about Mercedes before she got to the United States was she came here from Guatemala, and she fled Guatemala after she was attacked by 3 men when she was holding hands with her then girlfriend. These men were in uniforms and had guns, but she didn't quite know who they were. She speaks a little bit of English, but her preferred language is Spanish. And when she's talked about this incident with her partner, she refers to her partner as her ex. So with Mercedes and her situation in mind, we're going to move through each of those principles and think how we might be able to incorporate that principle into our first meeting with Mercedes. So principle number 1 is safety. And I think the key takeaway here is to be aware of triggers both within our office and other meeting environments and then to promote client comfort, control, and safety, both physical and emotional whenever possible. And we see a few examples of what this might look like on the screen. And this is talking about when we are physically in person with clients, where we have control over that environment. So having things like sensory-based objects. I love having stress balls in the office. Water is another great one. It can really help regulate breathing. I was once told you can't have a panic attack and hyperventilate and drink water at the same time. And as a sufferer of panic attacks, can validate that is true. And so now I love having water for myself, but also for clients as well. But I want to also think about what safety might look like in this post-COVID world, because I don't know about all of you, but for me, I would say probably 90 to 95% of my meetings with clients take place via Zoom now. And that's a totally different ballgame. We don't have control over the space that our client is in the same way that we would if we were in an office. We can't shut that door and know for a fact that we have full and complete privacy. We can't know what's happening on the other side of the screen outside of the little box around our client's face, right? So some things that I like to do when I'm meeting with somebody virtually is, first of all, have transparency about where I am in the space I'm in. So oftentimes I'm working from home. And so I'll tell people that, like, I'm home today and I'm home alone. So nobody, your privacy is still protected. Nobody can overhear our conversation. Or, sometimes my partner is working from home. And so I'll say that there is somebody else in the house with me, but I am in a separate room. I have the door closed. I have a white noise machine on. Another one that is very true, but often elicits laughs, is I say, if my client's speaking Spanish, because I'm bilingual, I say, also, we're speaking Spanish, and my partner doesn't understand a lick of Spanish. So that is inherently a nice little confidentiality layer there. But then not just talking about where I am, but talking about where my client is. Like, where are you right now? Are you home? What room are you in? Is there anybody else around you? Is there somewhere that you might be more comfortable? Is there anything that you want to have with you on your end? Do you want to grab a drink? Do you want to grab a blanket? What might make you more comfortable as we talk about as we move through our meeting? And being flexible. I mentioned when we started telling folks, feel free to go off camera if you want. I like mentioning that to clients. I was doing an intake a couple of weeks ago, and the woman that I was meeting with got very, very emotional when we were talking about a particularly rough memory. And I asked her, hey, are you okay? Do you want to take a break? Do you want to shut it down for today? You're also welcome to go off camera for a few minutes. And that's exactly what she did. She went off camera. She tried to come back at one point, but ultimately she stayed off camera for the rest of the meeting. Totally fine. Absolutely fine. And then also thinking about exit, right? So when we're in the office, we want to make sure our clients can see where to exit if they need to get out, if, they're starting to feel claustrophobic or anything. But making sure that our clients know how to exit the meeting, right? If they haven't used Zoom before, showing them how to leave the meeting if, again, they are just, they get to a point of overwhelm and can't move forward. So thinking about what this looks like virtually is just as important as when we're physically in spaces with our clients. And I want to just take a quick moment to acknowledge Alicia's question in the chat. So Alicia said, I have a ton of Afghan clients, and I'm curious what you think is the best approach to not getting so upset when they're asking all the questions in the asylum interviews that they already know the answers to. Re-traumatizing my clients makes me so upset, especially when it was, at least in part, the US government's fault that it happened the way it did in the first place. Oof, so well said, and so many points very validly made. Yeah, I'm laughing just because anybody who's interacted with the US asylum system, whether it's at the asylum office or immigration courts, can know exactly what Alicia is referring to. And candidly, probably any of our legal systems, right? The questioning that is done of people, particularly survivors, is often not done in a safe, friendly, supportive way. What's worse is when it should be, in theory, not an adversarial proceeding, like an asylum interview is in theory. So Alicia, for what it's worth, understanding that we have, this is getting a little into the weeds about asylum, but we have very little control at the asylum office, right? Our role as attorneys is very limited. The asylum officers often do not want to hear from us the same way that we would at least be able to object or speak out in court. So I'm judicious about when I interrupt an interview. But I do it. And I have done it when an officer is asking questions that are very clearly in the declaration, particularly if it's about a traumatic event. I'll politely interrupt and say, officer, if I may, for just one moment, I believe that we went into significant detail about this at paragraph 15 of my client's declaration, which you can find at exhibit A of our evidence package. And especially if I notice that my client is getting upset, I will say that, or I'll ask, can we take a moment, or do we need to go into this line of questioning? Can we get this information from somewhere else in our evidence package? I recognize that doing that is not always well received by the officer. And when appropriate, I think it is also very, very okay to ask for a supervisor as well. That's something candidly, like I forget about a lot. Because at the end of the day, in theory, these officers are supposed to be trained, particularly when working with young people. There are specific trainings that they go through for that. They are supposed to be trained at least in some level on empathetic approaches. I don't know what the trauma-informed training level is for them, but in theory, they are supposed to be trained on how to ask these questions in a sensitive manner. And I know that that's not always how they actually do it. So thank you for that question. I really appreciate it.
And Kaylee, sorry for jumping in, and sorry for the darkening room. But I just want to also say, sometimes what I'll say is, when we've spoken to asylum officers, a lot of times, they are trained to address all the issues. And so we just had an asylum interview last week. And I said, if the asylum officer is asking a lot of questions, it's partly because their job, in order to get an approval from their supervisor, in order to approve the file, they really have to ask all the questions. And so sometimes they're delving deep and going into some of the stuff that may not seem hugely relevant, is just their way of crossing their I's and dotting their I's and crossing their T's and making
I do that all the time.
Oh gosh, that they can support, their decision to approve. And I don't think there's any guarantees, but I think some of my shortest asylum interviews have been ones where they're just going to refer it, in other words, deny it. And the longer ones have been where they're really trying to, create the record so they can say to their supervisor, I did it and it's solid. Anyway, sorry to jump in on that, but that's another way of looking at it.
Not at all. I think that's a really great point. And honestly, Sheila, you are reading my mind, because one of the things we're going to talk about is that principle of transparency, right? And I think that's exactly it. Letting our clients know what to expect and being very explicit with them about what is going to happen and why. Maybe we can't avoid those questions, but maybe we can at least contextualize them for them so they don't feel caught off guard and they feel like they understand why they are being asked this. So I couldn't agree more. I think that's a fantastic suggestion. So with this in mind, this concept of safety, right? Let's think about Mercedes and what we know about her and what physical safety considerations we want to be mindful of based on her experiences. And so I want us to navigate back over to Menti, and I want to see what folks might think of. And so just as a reminder, Mercedes was in, it sounds like some sort of a abusive or intimate partner violence situation with her partner. There was an incident in April 2022 where her partner slapped her across the face, told her she'd regret it if she didn't shut up and listen. Sounds like there had been other incidents of violence, but she didn't have a lot of details around those. There was also an attack when she was in her home country of Guatemala, when she was holding hands with a girlfriend by men who were armed and wearing uniforms. So based on all of that, what are some safety considerations that we want to be thinking about during that first meeting with Mercedes? And just a reminder for folks, navigate to www.menti.com, and the code is 55927888. And that's up on our screen as well. So I'll give everybody a minute to think that through, and let's see what our responses are. So understanding she might not have a safe place to go. Absolutely, right? Especially if we're meeting with her virtually. We know that she's back in the apartment with her partner, and that at least historically has not always been a safe space for her. So thinking about, where is she right now when we're talking with her? Who is there? Is it a safe space? Can she speak freely and speak openly? Making sure her number is safe to call. I'm so happy that this was brought up. Anybody who's ever worked with IPV survivors, intimate partner violence, this is one of the biggest things, is making sure we have a safe contact method. And I think you can get really creative. Talk to your clients, right? Maybe they're going to save your number in their phone as something benign, a friend's name or something else. Is there a code word that you can use? Like, hey, I wanted to see if we can talk about the test, or, something that if it was seen by a partner, they could explain away easily. really getting creative about that and asking what's going to be safe for them, bringing them into that process about what methods of communication are safe and what is okay to communicate. Thinking about her safety and suicidal thoughts with bringing up the trauma again. That's a really, really great point. And I don't think that that was one that I had, brought up on the slide or honestly even thought about with this hypo, right? What is it going to be like for her when we talk about some of these things? And we'll get to this later, but what support systems might she have in place? What support systems can we help put in place for her to support that? Creating that safety plan, right? So thinking again, the fact that she might not be in a safe place at home. Thinking about who might be triggering, what types of people, even if they are benign, but like males, police, government officials, right? So let's say she wants to do an order of protection. That means that we may have to go to court. That means that there might be a court officer there who's in a uniform and might have a gun. And what is that experience going to be like for her? Absolutely. Understanding that victims tend to go back to the offender and checking up on her, making calls or texts, finding safe words. You read my mind on that. But that understanding that victims tend to go back to the offender, 100%, 100%. I don't mean 100% of the time. I mean, 100%, that is a very important thing to keep in mind when working, particularly with survivors of domestic violence. It is often a cycle. People often have to try many times before they leave. And also leaving is an incredibly personal and complicated decision. And I agree wholeheartedly that understanding that as providers and understanding that there may come a time when somebody goes back and it is hard for us to accept that. But the most important and helpful thing that we can do is to just remain available and remain supportive and non-judgmental. Great job, guys. Thank you so much. So our next principle is trustworthiness and transparency. Sheila kind of read us into that one with her wonderful example for the asylum office. So here we want to be thinking about previewing for our client what lies ahead in our relationship, as well as the legal process or whatever process we're going to be helping them with, especially if it's a legal case, because the legal system itself may be a source of trauma and fear. That transparency is going to facilitate trust and minimize feelings of powerlessness. So thinking here, not just what Sheila mentioned about, playing out what's going to happen. I like to say road mapping. That's one of my favorite tools. So not just road mapping what's going to happen at the court hearing, at the asylum interview, but also road mapping our relationship. What are our roles? What is expected of me? What is expected of you? What is the entire roadmap of the case going to look like? For a U visa case, I want to make sure people know that this is going to be like upwards of a decade for a process and a lot of waiting. Also road mapping on the micro level too, like road mapping an individual meeting. Hey, today I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about what happened in April so I understand what brought you to seek our services in the first place. We don't have to talk about your entire relationship today. I'd just like to get a little bit of a sense of what's going on for you urgently right now and what you need and what you're hoping to achieve by seeking out our help. Right? And so that they have an understanding of what's going to be talked about today, what are we going to be doing today and focusing on. And also road mapping for the next meeting. Next time, I'd like to talk a little bit about, the incident that happened in Guatemala. And I understand that might be tough to talk about. So I want to make sure that you have some preparation and can feel like you can emotionally prepare for that. And also let me know that day if you're not in a place to talk about that, right? And thinking too about how things that we do that are benign might be misinterpreted by people, especially knowing that people who have gone through trauma often struggle with trust, right? So something as simple as taking notes. I take notes every time I meet with a client. I type on my computer because I type way faster than I handwrite. And I do that all the time and I do it without thinking, right? But a client, whether it's in person or via Zoom, they can hear me typing away on my keyboard. They don't know what I'm typing. They can't see my screen. So they don't know if I'm typing notes or if I'm typing a Slack message to a colleague. And even if they do know that I'm typing notes, they don't know unless I tell them what's going to be done with those notes. Am I going to share them with anyone? So I try to remind myself to be very explicit. Hey, I'm going to be taking some notes while we're talking, if that's okay with you. The reason that I'm doing that is because I want to be able to remember everything that you're telling me. Everything you're saying is very important. And I'm going to be able to look back on these notes after our meeting to remind myself of some of the things that we discussed today. These notes, just like our conversation, is completely confidential and protected by attorney-client privilege. And so it's not going to be shared with anybody outside of my organization, right? So that kind of sets up the expectation and understanding what's happening on my end. And also things as simple as looking away from the camera, going back to thinking about what this looks like post-COVID. I have 2 monitors at home, which I love. But oftentimes that means I'll have my Zoom meeting pulled up on my laptop, and then maybe client files or client documents pulled up on my other screen. So I'm often looking off to the side. Now, if I don't tell my client what's going on, it might just look like I'm distracted. I'm looking elsewhere. I'm not interested in what they're saying. So I want to be thinking about how my actions might be perceived without context, and then be really transparent about what's going on my end. So thinking about transparency, what is one step that we can take to foster transparency during our first meeting with Mercedes? And if everybody can click back over to Menti, I would love to hear your thoughts about this. And just again, for folks, if it's helpful, 55927888 is our code. Thinking about things like road mapping and explaining actions on our part and explaining what the process is going to look like and what our role is, asking what is expected of us on her end. So thinking of all of these things and how we can build that trust and transparency. Telling Mercedes how the process works and why we ask all those questions at intake, right? And not just the substantive questions. I feel like sometimes the ones that throw people off are like the demographic questions, like your income, right? I often feel like people panic when I ask them what their income is, because I started to realize people think that that's connected with whether or not I can help them. So I've started to remind myself to explicitly say, I'm asking about your income just because it's a point of data that we collect. It has no bearing on whether we can help you or not. So agreed. Letting her know she's in a safe and confidential space, especially LGBTQ friendly. That's important because depending on what culture or country she might have come from, those spaces may not exist for her. So she might not know whether it's okay to talk about her sexual orientation, because depending on what her experiences have been in her home country or in her culture, that may not be a thing. Good to know I'm not the only one with 2 monitors out there. Oh, I like to hold a hand up at any time if they need to take a break. Oh, I really like that. Oh, gonna write that one down for myself. Love that, because I think it's often hard sometimes to articulate when you need a break or when you need something. So I love the idea of just like a nonverbal cue that you can both agree on when we need to take a pause. Love that. Thank you so much. Being honest about negative outcomes. Absolutely. We cannot control so much of the systems that we interact with, and just being upfront and honest with our clients from the start so that they can prepare themselves. They are resilient. They have survived so much. They can handle knowing that there's a possibility of a bad outcome. And one of the things that we can do to help them with that is just to be upfront about it. Having a translator appropriate. Absolutely. Realistic expectations, confidentiality. Love those checking in moments. Absolutely. Another tip I've heard on like the check-in moments is establishing at the top of a meeting like a sort of emotional scale. So if like 1 is calm as a cucumber, absolutely chill. 10 is the most stressed out and emotional that you've ever been in your entire life. Using that as sort of a gauge and saying, hey, like, where are you right now on a 1 to 10? And maybe agreeing too at the top of the meeting, if we get to a 5 or if we get to a 6, that's when we're going to automatically just take a break. That's the breaking point as far as tolerance goes. These are excellent, excellent suggestions. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate these, and you got me thinking too. So our next principle is support. So I am a massive proponent of multidisciplinary practice when it comes to trauma survivors, because as we talked about before, trauma has wide-reaching and complex impacts on people's lives. And we are almost never, as one individual service provider, going to be able to respond to all of those, right? At the end of the day, I'm an attorney. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a friend. I'm not a doctor. And the second that I take that attorney hat off and try to be one of those things, I'm not only doing a massive disservice to my client, because I do not have the professional qualifications for that. And I'm also taking away from my ability to do the thing that they came to me for, which is be a lawyer. I'm also doing a disservice for myself, because I've got limited bandwidth. And if I start trying to be everything for every single one of my clients, I'm going to burn out really, really fast. So when we think about support, we want to try to anticipate some of the issues that might come up during our work with the client and in the case that might, especially those that might be particularly distressing or destabilizing. And then we want to try to build out that support system for our client so that other people can be there to help identify situations that are stressful or triggering, and then also be available to help support when those things happen. So thinking about who is already part of our client system and who can we add to that, right? Are there targeted referrals that we can make? And I'm always a really big fan, as much as we can do this, and I know this isn't always possible, but of a warm referral. So instead of just handing a number and saying, call this, because as we all know, even in our own organizations, that number is often not very easy to navigate. So whenever possible, being able to have a warm referral and say, hey, Mercedes, this is so-and-so, my colleague at this organization. She does this at this organization. She can help you get this service that we talked about. This is her contact information. So-and-so, this is Mercedes, go on and talk from there. Keeping in mind that we want to have releases on file where appropriate, particularly if we're working for grant-funded programs that require higher levels of confidentiality. And then once we do have other folks involved, once we do have other providers involved, thinking of how we want to move forward with that information. So on the one hand, how can they support and help what we're doing with the client? So for me, I always think if I have a client who's engaged in therapy or advocacy services of some kind, we might be able to have that person write a letter that might support the legal arguments in our case. But also there's other ways that person might help. Maybe if my client's in therapy, maybe my client and their therapist are working on a grounding technique in their sessions that we can bring into our meeting. So if I have that release on file and permission to talk to their therapist might be able to share that with me, and I can incorporate that and help our meetings be safer and also help them develop those really healthy coping skills. And then also thinking about scheduling and what that means, because on the flip side, if you have somebody who is able to engage with multiple service providers, that means that their schedules are going to be pretty packed. So maybe you don't want to have your meeting with your client on the same day that they're meeting with their therapist, especially if you plan to talk about something emotionally charged. On the other hand, I once was working with a client who had a domestic violence advocate, and we were going to be talking about a really, really tough event. And so the three of us were in touch, and they actually proactively scheduled a meeting immediately following ours, so that right when my client and I were finished, she could go right into the meeting with her domestic violence advocate to kind of help her decompress and come down from a really, really emotionally charged meeting. So being strategic about that on both ends can be really, really helpful. So thinking about what we know about Mercedes, who might already be a part of her support system that we want to be engaging with, maybe getting releases for, and encouraging her to reach out to. And so just as a bit of a reminder, thinking about where Mercedes' referral came from, how did she find our services? Who are the people that we know are in Mercedes' life? Who has she interacted with that we know about? And thinking about who we might be able to identify there. Clergy, family, okay. Absolutely great examples. I don't think that we had specific facts about those, but absolutely things to ask about. And that's a really great point. We don't want to just be limited to what information might be on an intake sheet. Friends, right? We know that she left her apartment to go live with a friend for a while. So presumably that is a friend who is close, if she was able to go live with her. Will go live with the friend. And then also it's presumably somebody who's safe and who she trusts. So who is that person, and how might we be able to tap into that resource? Did anybody happen to remember or catch how Mercedes came to us? I'll give it a minute in case anybody remembers. So we know that she was referred by a domestic violence advocate, which is great. Right. So that means that she is already engaged in some other services. She's already got somebody who is helping her. Other organizations. Yeah. So finding out what that organization is she still working with that advocate? Can we get a release on file? And if she's not, maybe it was just, a one-time, crisis consultation and a handoff. Does she want to engage in supportive services? Does she want to engage in advocacy? Is there another place that we can refer her? Absolutely. So our next principle is collaboration and mutuality. And here we want to think about approaching our relationship with clients as a partnership, beginning by acknowledging the inherent power differences in our relationship. And this is particularly true of the attorney-client relationship. Right? We are the ones who, and it's true also not of attorneys, right? We are often the ones who have the knowledge of the system that we're interacting with. We are the ones who have the degree or the license or the title or whatever the thing is. And even if we don't intend for that to give us power, it does, it inherently does. And that might be exacerbated even more by differences in culture, right? I have a lot of clients who are incredibly deferential to me simply because I am an attorney, like more so than I notice from clients from other cultures. And I have to be mindful of that, right? And then also language, education, race, gender, those can also impact and exacerbate those power differences, excuse me. So then we want to actively seek out ways to level that playing field by bringing our client into the process and inviting them to collaborate, to brainstorm, and to problem solve with us, right? So for example, for me as an attorney, explaining the law of asylum and theory of our case in an accessible way might allow my client to help contribute to evidence collection. They might think, there's a picture of me on social media from this organization that I was part of when we did a protest. And maybe we didn't talk about that before, but when I explained to them, the requirement for corroborating evidence and what constitutes a political opinion, maybe the light bulbs go off for them and they can really start coming up with ideas that I might not have thought of otherwise. And then encouraging open and honest communication about your relationship, because at the end of the day, this is a relationship, albeit a professional one. So it takes effort, it takes energy, it takes time. So talking about how you see your roles, what are your expectations of each other? Has your client had prior interactions with an attorney or a service provider like you? And what was good about that? What wasn't good about that? When it comes to then actually doing the work and timelines, having both of you contribute to timelines and pace setting is important. So maybe for me, again, as an attorney, maybe I can outline what's needed for my client to achieve their goal. We want to apply for asylum. We have to file a 589, and then we have to go to court to see the judge, and then we have to get a hearing date and then prepare your declaration and setting out all those things. And then also acknowledging what deadlines might be inflexible. We have 1 year to file your I-589. We can't change that. We absolutely have to do that. And then from there, the client can identify their needs and boundaries when working within those limitations and those deadlines. So, okay, if we have a year to prepare my asylum application, I don't want to do it all at once. I think we need to space it out over 6 months. It's going to be really hard for me to remember and think back to all this stuff in 1 month and a month's worth of meetings, just as an example. And then when it comes to mistakes, right, I mentioned that before, they are inevitable and it is okay. And we're going to make them, but take responsibility for them, acknowledge them and apologize, because I really genuinely believe there is so much empowerment and validation in simply acknowledging that you caused harm, no matter how unintentional it might have been. Right. So I try to remind myself of that when I mess up. I remember I was working with one woman on her green card application we had done her asylum case a year earlier. And for anybody who's done a green card application, especially compared to asylum, it's like a cakewalk. It's a long, tedious application, but it's very easy from like a legal standpoint, especially for asylees. So I told her, look, this is going to be a really straightforward thing. It'll take maybe an hour of a meeting. It'd be real easy, no big deal, nothing like what it was when we had to go to court and you had to testify for the asylum case. And also, if you're familiar with the green card application, you'll know that there's a question about whether you've ever been in immigration court before. Doesn't ask what happened, doesn't ask, what you testified about, just literally like a yes or a no question. That question alone was so destabilizing and triggering for my client, because that process of being in court and testifying about the horrific things that had happened to her was so re-traumatizing. She hated having to talk about court. She never wanted to go back and think about it. And so simply asking, because I do technically have to ask, even though I know the answer to it, simply saying, have you ever been in immigration court proceedings? That was enough for her to say, oh my gosh, no, like, why are we going back to this moment? And she ended the meeting and we had to pick up another day. And I realized my mistake, right? Because I was thinking about that form, not from her perspective. I was thinking of it from my perspective as the attorney. I wasn't thinking about what that experience was going to be like for her. And I apologized and I was real explicit about that. I was like, this is where I messed up and this is what I'm going to do differently in the future. And I think that in and of itself is putting power and control back in her hands, right? It is saying your words and your actions were meaningful and powerful enough for me to change something about the way that I respond. So thinking about even that as a way of being trauma informed and putting control back. So when we think about Mercedes, what are some factors that we want to be aware of when seeking to level those power differences between us and between her? And particularly, thinking about if we are attorneys or if we are in, highly educated fields with a, some sort of a license or degree or something like that, as I know a lot of us are. Oh, I'm so sorry. You know what I did? I did not add this question to the Mentimeter, so I apologize sincerely. If anybody wants to add their thoughts on this question, I'll go back to this slide about what factors we want to be aware of when seeking to level those power differences. If anybody wants to put those into our Q&A box, I would be happy to share those with the group and we can get some thoughts from folks, but otherwise we can also move on to the next principle. So my apologies for missing that question on our Menti slide. So what factors we want to be aware of when seeking to level those power differences. So just as folks are thinking, because I also recognize that sharing in the chat is not anonymous as Menti is, and that might make it a little less comfortable for people. So honestly, as simple as, thinking about where we're sitting, right? So a lot of times we're sitting on one side of a desk and our client is on the other. And that's literally like has this huge thing between us. So that's a simple thing, maybe just rearranging the seating so we're on the same side, right? Also thinking about not telling her what we're going to do, not saying we'll meet Thursday at 10, saying I'm available Thursday at 10 and 1. I'm also available Friday at 3 and 4. Would any of those work for you? That is something so small and so subtle, but it's so different from saying we'll meet at 10 o'clock, right? It comes across so differently because it's putting it entirely in her hands instead of us taking that power and telling her what's going to happen. So our next principle here is empowerment, voice, and choice. So the key takeaway with this is giving our clients a voice in decisions that impact them in a way that is purposeful and exceeds our baseline ethical requirements. We want to be actively empowering our clients by validating their strengths and helping develop their decision-making and related life skills. And I think this really goes hand in hand with collaboration and mutuality, which we just talked about, that simplicity of, selecting the date of your next meeting instead of telling them, or selecting how you're going to meet, Zoom, phone, in person. I also really love using affirming and mirroring language. So what this means is paying attention to how my client describes things that have happened to them and making sure that I use similar words when describing it back to them. I once worked with a young woman who had been sexually assaulted by her father, and we were applying for a U visa, so we had to talk a little bit about that in her statement. And I asked her, how do you want to refer to him? Do you want to refer to him as my father? Do you want to refer to him as, his first name? Do you want to refer to him as the abuser? And she sat there and she thought about it for a minute. And she said, I want to refer to him as the demon. So we did. And that's what we called him for the rest of our relationship. And when it came time to write that declaration for the U visa case, I first identified him by name. I explained to her why I was doing that, just so USCIS, not the brightest bulbs, would know who it was I was talking about. And then just did like a little footnote that this is who we're referring to. And then from then on out, for the rest of her declaration, we referred to him as the demon. And that's small, that's subtle, but that's saying you get to tell me how this experience went for you. You get to tell your story. You get to tell your narrative. I don't want to be the one choosing those words for you. And really putting value on people's identities outside of the trauma. I mentioned that, before, to David's point about, that maybe over over validation of the trauma can kind of put it at the forefront in a way that it puts other things in the back burner. And I think that this is an important part of it, right? Like getting to know people outside of the bad thing that happened to them, because they are so much more than that. And it can be kind of a nice reminder too sometimes. Like I think that like as a trauma survivor, especially if you're involved in different systems, you are often having to tell the trauma story over and over and over and over again. And it can kind of start to feel like this is the only thing that matters. Like this is all people care about. So talking about, like if you're in school, like what are you studying? What are your favorite subjects? Or, they have kids, like, what are you doing with your kids today? What do you like to do on the weekends? And that also goes hand in hand with building trust and rapport. So it really just all kind of snowballs and helps from there. So thinking about Mercedes, which of the words that she's used in her experience and in the narrative that we got in her intake, might we want to mirror to empower and affirm her telling of her experiences? And we should have this one on the Mentimeter. There we go. Again, sorry about that we missed the last one. So what are some words that you remember, ways that she described things that we want to maybe be mindful of and mirror back to her? And as folks are thinking about this, I want to mention a question from Louisa, who said, how do you do this when it comes to putting together the declaration of somebody who does not speak English? Do they write it in their language and you translate it? So I think that this is a bit of a personal approach and also sometimes a time limited approach. I think in a perfect world, what I would probably do with every declaration is write it out in English, just because that's the language that I use. So that's probably what I would use to draft it, and then translate it into my client's native language for them to review, and then also perhaps to submit that as the primary declaration with the English version as like a certified translation. We don't always have time for that. So one thing that I have done in the past, if we don't have the time or translation resources to have an entire 15-page declaration translated, is sometimes I'll use specific phrases. Like if there's a phrase that my client uses to describe something that's really, really compelling, or if there's a particular word that they use, I'll actually use that word in their language in the declaration and often just like footnote it with the translation. So that's something that I've done before. So somebody wrote words for the abuse suffered. Absolutely, right? So we can very easily like knee jerk to calling this abuse or mistreatment or, harm or whatever word, but maybe that's not how she describes it. I have very, very often encountered people who, in my perspective, use words that to me sound very minimizing of what happened to them. And I have to catch myself, right? Because yeah, that's how I'm perceiving it, but this is how they're telling me it's that they're recalling it right now. I've sometimes, for example, had people describe something that is clearly rape by the legal definition, and they don't call it that. They call it sex, right? We had sex. And that's tough, especially from an attorney perspective, because I have to, sometimes maybe we need to actually have it be rape because that's the wording that needs to be used from a legal standpoint. But absolutely. And I think one of the other things about Mercedes is we know that she refers to her partner as her ex. So I think that's important too, because that can reflect where she is in the process. We talked about how IPV survivors often go back to abusers. So maybe they're in a reconciliation point and maybe she doesn't feel comfortable calling her ex. Maybe she starts calling her by her name, and just being cognizant that might shift as your relationship goes on and just making sure to mirror that back whenever possible. So our last principle here is cultural, historical, and gender issues. And I want to just give a disclaimer on this. This is not at all intended to be a complete exploration of this topic by any stretch. This could be a training on its own, a standalone training. This is simply to recognize the importance of this as a component of trauma-informed care and intended to open a conversation and a dialogue about these issues, not intended to, limit the framework on how you want to talk about this to the way that I might be talking about it tonight. So here, thinking about how our own cultural stereotypes and biases might show up in order to actively confront, name, and engage with them. And I have to give credit to a dear friend and colleague of mine who chose that word engage. And I really thought that was really insightful, because we don't want to dismiss them or overcome them, because oftentimes it's not possible, right? When we talk about systemic racism, there's a lot of systemic racism that is baked into me as a white woman in America that I don't know that I'll ever be able to get rid of. Like, that's part and parcel of what I grew up in. So, overcoming or dismissing or letting go of, like, that's not necessarily realistic. I love this concept of engaging with, right? That's this very active verb of thinking of what is this, what's going on, where is this coming from, and how do I want to respond? And we want to be able to provide services that are gender inclusive, that leverage the healing value of our clients' traditional cultural connections, and is responsive to their racial, ethnic, and cultural needs, and also addresses and recognizes historical trauma that they may have experienced or their culture may have experienced. And I'm sure folks have heard of the term cultural humility, but I really resonate with that, or really resonates with me a lot more than cultural competence. I learned the term cultural humility a few years ago, and it's really stuck with me. And the National Institutes of Health defines it as this lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby the individual not only learns about somebody else's culture, but starts with an examination of their own beliefs and cultural identities. And I think that's really at the heart of it, right? Thinking of, questions like, which parts of my identity am I aware of? Which are most salient? Which parts of my identity are privileged? Which parts are marginalized? How does my sense of identity shift based on context and settings? And what are the parts of my identity onto which people project, and which parts are received well, by whom? And what might my blind spots and biases be? And I say all of this just acknowledging the fact that I am, again, a white, cisgender, straight woman from a upper middle class upbringing in suburban Connecticut. So there are layers and layers, and I'm an attorney, right, with higher education, layers and layers and layers of privilege that are inherently part of my identity, good, bad, worse, whatever. And I need to be aware of those. I need to be aware of how those show up when I'm working with people who come from different backgrounds, whether I intend for it to or not, right? So if I'm working with somebody who identifies as BIPOC, who isn't white, there is inherently going to be the fact that I am a white woman and they are a non-white person in the room, no matter if I'm putting that at the front or not. So it's very possible that something that I say that in my mind is benign could be interpreted in a much different way simply because of the racial differences between us. And I need to be aware of that. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to screw up. That doesn't mean that I'm going to misstep, but I need to be aware of that. And this goes beyond race as well, right? This goes to culture and being aware of cultural differences. This goes to sexual orientation and gender identity. One that I mess up, I am working so hard on, is pronouns. I just misgendered somebody the other day, and I'm still working on that. And then, like, the right balance of apology without going overboard. These are all really just important things that we want to be aware of. And when we're operating with cultural humility, we want to be listening with interest and curiosity, and having awareness of those possible biases within ourselves, and attempting to have a non-judgmental stance about the things that we're hearing from our client, and recognize our inherent status of privilege as an attorney, as somebody with an advanced degree, and be willing to be taught by our clients. And I don't know where it went, but I saw somebody put in the question and answer earlier to tell Mercedes that we're learning so much from her. And I could not agree more with that. I think that's a beautiful sentiment. So lastly, before we move on to self-care, community care in the last 15 minutes, we always run out of time. I'm so sorry. But let's think quickly about, what do we know about Mercedes identities that require us to practice cultural humility? To show answers. And I want to just acknowledge, we had a comment in the chat that I find this apologizing disgusting. And I'm not sure candidly what apologizing we're referring to, the being sensitive to where somebody's coming from, but that's too much. So to be clear, I don't mean to say that any of us should apologize for who we are or what our identities are. I can't change the fact that I am a white woman, like all of these things, right? I do think it's important to be aware of it, right? Because it's there and it has implications, and that's going to impact how we interact with people. And it's not just a racial thing. Like I said, it's a cultural thing, right? I might make assumptions about my client's availability on a particular day that perhaps in their culture, in their religion, is a very holy or sacred day that they would not be doing anything on that day. And I don't know about that because that's not my religious background. And just being open and curious and being willing to learn and recognize where those differences occur and how that can impact our relationships. And that's all I mean to say by it. So with Mercedes, a couple of things that folks are pointing out: she came from Latin America. Okay, so that tells us maybe a little bit about cultural differences. So for instance, we know she identifies as bisexual and she's LGBTQ. What is it like for her in the culture that she comes from to identify that way? I honestly, one of the things that I've screwed up, right? Like, I've worked with clients who are from countries or are from cultures that are very, very anti-LGBTQ. And they might still be on their own journey of identification and self-exploration. But one thing that I had to start realizing was I have an innate comfort in talking about those topics because of my culture and where I grew up. And I started to realize that I was more comfortable with it than perhaps my clients were. So there's like an example of being totally good intentioned, well-intentioned by that, and being open about it and not realizing that I might have been maybe moving a little too fast, so to speak. Because that isn't something that is openly talked about where my client comes from. Love this point about the language. She might not even speak Spanish because so many of the populations in Guatemala are indigenous and speak completely different languages. That's such a great point. And God knows the US government makes a lot of assumptions about that. A lot of times if they see our clients are from certain countries, they automatically assume it's Spanish. So we want to make sure we're not making that same mistake. Absolutely. She's a survivor, for lack of a better word. I love that parentheses because, again, thinking about what word resonates for her. I personally don't love the word victim. A lot of times I use that word because it's part of like our nomenclature, like victim-based forms of immigration relief. But I like to be open and ask people how they identify. So I agree with that. These are all excellent points. I really, really appreciate it. And I also appreciate, the challenges to what I'm saying in the chat box. I'm not the end all be all. I am probably going to say things imperfectly tonight. And we're going to have different perspectives. And I deeply, deeply appreciate the opportunity for discussion and dialogue. So I just really want to thank everybody for sharing their thoughts. I had hoped that we would have time for a 5-minute break, but we are closing in on 10 minutes and still have so much to talk about. So I'm going to skip this over. I apologize sincerely for this. And if anybody does want to hop off or take a break, again, by all means, that is okay. We will circulate these slides afterwards. So we talked about how trauma impacts our clients, but it is absolutely undeniable that we are impacted by our clients' trauma as well. And this quote for me just really hits the nail on the head. The expectation that we can be immersed in the suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet. Just strikes me every single time, right? We talked about the different forms of work-related stress: burnout, empathy, fatigue, secondary stress, etc. I want to just identify a couple on the screen and just maybe talk about a few of the differences. When we think about professional burnout, we're often talking about things that aren't necessarily related to providing service to trauma survivors, right? Somebody in, the financial services industry who has perhaps no direct client or person interaction, maybe they're on the computer all day, they can experience professional burnout from just low job satisfaction, not being able to take enough breaks. And by no means am I minimizing that at all. I just want to draw out some differences here. Compassion fatigue is where we start to have, our well of empathy, as I like to think of it, starts to feel like it's running dry. If you only have so much empathy to give, having to emote and give that out constantly day in and day out, you can start to feel like there's not a lot left, and you can start to feel almost like a callousness towards things that you're hearing. And then we have vicarious trauma, which is also related to secondary traumatic stress. And this is where somebody who's in a service provider role can actually start to develop and display some of the symptoms that mirror PTSD when we think of like a direct trauma survivor, which is a pretty crazy thing to think about, because you could have somebody who's never personally experienced a traumatic event, but is simply exposed repeatedly to the trauma of others, and as a result starts experiencing PTSD-like symptoms. And anybody who works with trauma survivors is at risk of developing work-related stress. That being said, there are a couple of factors that might make somebody a little bit more susceptible to developing that work-related stress. Oops, apologies. And I am so sorry. I actually don't know why my little blocks are not showing up here, but thankfully I remember what a few of them are. So things like working in isolation, having prior trauma or mental health struggles of your own, being new to the profession, right? So oftentimes people who are new attorneys struggle the most because they haven't had a lot of exposure to trauma. And going back to the point about having your own personal trauma or your own mental health struggles, obviously that's something to be aware of. And the point of all of these, which we can't see on the screen, I'm so sorry about that, is not to say that if you identify with any of those things, you are guaranteed to develop secondary trauma. It's just to say that this is important information to know about yourself, just like if you have a predisposition to a particular, genetic disorder or illness, right? Doesn't mean you're going to get it, but you need to know. It's helpful for you to know and how you take care of yourself and what steps you take to try to prevent that from happening. It's important to know that you have that higher risk factor, right? So when we think about our own personal experiences, it is a very common thing, as I'm sure you all know, people who have gone through trauma often end up in trauma providing services, right? That's often what drives us, even if we don't realize it. And that can be a really difficult thing, especially if you have trauma that mirrors or is similar to things that your clients have gone through. That can be really, really tough to deal with and balance. And so we want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves with that maybe we're cautious about what types of cases that we take on, if we can have a say in that and have some control over that. The flip side of that is and this doesn't have to be the case for everybody, but if it feels safe to do so, being able to tap into your own experiences can actually be an incredible superpower in being able to relate and have empathy for the people that you're working with. So disclosure, I'm a survivor of intimate partner violence, and I had been doing that work for years. My first internship in law school was with a domestic violence agency. So I knew about the power and control wheel. I knew about the psychology of the domestic violence cycle, all of these things. I had like the facts about it, or, whatever it is. I didn't understand it until I went through it myself, or certainly didn't understand it in that same way. And so after I went through that, I found myself hearing my clients' stories in a totally different way and responding differently, because I could relate, I could understand to the push and the pull and the confusion and the back and the forth and all of these things that are often very difficult to conceptualize if you haven't been through that. And it certainly has made it harder at times to hear some of those stories. And sometimes they remind me of things I've been through. But honestly, I think it's made me a better advocate. I think I've been able to connect and support people who have been through those things in a way that I wasn't doing before. And candidly, like, I was judging people, even, given all that I knew about domestic violence. I judge people sometimes when I was like, wow, you're going back again. But once I went through that, I never judged that again, because I could understand it in this totally different light. So again, that's not going to be safe emotionally for everybody, but I do just encourage you to don't necessarily view that as a negative. That could be an incredible, incredible source of strength and power as a provider. I want to just touch briefly, for those of us who are attorneys in the room, that there's a real intersection between secondary trauma and ethical duties. And I don't mean to say that if you struggle with secondary trauma, you are therefore unethical or breaching your ethical duties. In fact, I would say it's the exact opposite. I would challenge us to think we have these heightened ethical responsibilities. And as I say this, I recognize that this certainly doesn't apply just to attorneys, although I'm not intimately familiar with the ethical responsibilities of other professions, but I know it's not just ours. So we're expected to abide by this heightened code of ethics, right? So I see that as a permission structure for us to do whatever is necessary to uphold those responsibilities, including making sure that we are taking care of ourselves. Because if we are suffering from secondary trauma, from burnout, it's going to impact our ability to be competent, to be diligent in our representation, to communicate with our clients. And this goes for supervisors as well, right? So one of our rules of supervisors is that it is our responsibility to make sure that the work product of attorneys and non-attorneys that we supervise comports with these requirements. I see that also as a requirement to make sure that they not only have the tools to substantively do the job, but to safely emotionally do the job. So I see that as a responsibility to teach staff about trauma and to support them and to provide structures and systems that really promote a trauma-informed work environment. And with that being said, I think the question for me has always been, what does it actually look like to engage in meaningful self-care, right? Especially in my world as an attorney, it's very fast-paced, high stress. And so yoga and walks on the beach are lovely, but that doesn't always feel realistic for my day-to-day. I really struggled with a lot of those traditional notions around self-care. And so not that there's anything wrong with those things, but I just wanted something that I could use day in, day out with my busy schedule that felt realistic, that I was making steps towards being more caring and protective of my emotional boundaries. So I have a few suggestions, which I am going to breeze through super quick. And again, I am so sorry for this. I'm more than happy to share, again, these slides, and I'm happy to maybe even type up a little summary of some of the things I normally talk about when we move through these. But first and foremost, boundaries, right? Enforcing regular office hours, separating your home and workspaces, harder in the pandemic, I know. Limiting client access to personal information. I love, if possible, if you have the resources, to have 2 separate phones, one for work, one for personal. And really logging out at the end of the day and being done when you step away from your computer, from your workspace. Next, valuing your time. So thinking about how you structure your day. Can you place a limit on how many client meetings you have or how long those meetings go? Maybe you break your client meetings up with other things that you have to get done, note taking. That can be a productive but decompressing kind of activity. And if you have control over it, thinking about mixing up your case types. Maybe if you have a team, you can get creative about how you assign cases. If sexual assault cases for you are really difficult, but maybe it's something that's not as challenging for a colleague. And maybe you can find a way to work out which cases go to who, depending on what their different strength and resilience factors are. And last but not least, support, right? We know that working in working in a silo, working in a vacuum on your own is one of the factors that contributes to developing work-related stress. So thinking about our role, if you're in a supervisory or managerial or leadership position, what this means for the type of support that you're providing. For instance, when I do weekly one-on-ones with staff, we have an agenda, and the first item on the agenda is always check-in. How are you doing? And that does not mean how your caseload is going. That does not mean how the hearing went this week. That means, how are you? What's going on for you today? What are you showing up with? Did you have a breakup? Are you not feeling well? Like, what's going on in your life that's going to impact how you're showing up to work and how we can support you? And if you don't have those structures in place, maybe you do work in like a solo practice or something, creating those supports elsewhere, creating networks of colleagues that maybe you can have like a lunch call with other solo providers, that you can all hop on a call and talk through things together. Somebody mentioned before debriefing. I am a huge fan of debriefing. So scheduling debriefing and decompressing time for myself after difficult meetings, but also consciously and proactively scheduling and setting time to debrief with colleagues, and not just talk about, the substantive case or what's happening in the case, but damn, I just heard some really awful things and I just need to talk to another human being about it. Like that's what we want to do when we're debriefing. So last, I want to end with this concept of trauma stewardship. And this was coined by author Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, who wrote a wonderful book on this topic. And she defines trauma stewardship as a daily practice through which individuals, organizations, and society tend to the hardship, pain, or trauma experienced by humans in a sustainable and intentional way. And so for this, I want us to take away the idea that we have a collective responsibility to ourselves, to our clients, and to each other to educate ourselves about trauma and its impacts, actively practicing trauma-informed care, including making those mistakes and learning from each other and continuing to strive to do better, and intentionally creating supportive, healthy, and sustainable cultures from the bottom up as well as from the top down. And so I want everybody today to maybe just walk away from our conversation and think about what is one thing that you can do to engage in trauma stewardship. And that can be something you will do to take care of yourself, take care of your client, take care of your colleagues, take care of your organization, anything at all. I want you to think about one thing and dedicate the next week to trying to incorporate that into how you show up to your work life every day. And the last thing I will leave everybody with before we finish, and I know I am 1 minute over, and I'm so sorry for having to rush through everything at the end. I mentioned earlier this concept of vicarious resilience, and this is that flip side of the vicarious trauma coin. So in the same way that we cannot expect to not be touched, not be impacted by hearing the trauma, the stories that our clients have gone through, we also cannot expect to not be impacted by their incredibly deep resilience. This concept of vicarious resilience was first coined in the mid 2000s, and it was the psychotherapists who were studying providers working with victims and families of political violence. And they found that for these providers, watching their clients overcome adversity and demonstrate this immense capacity to heal had a positive impact on them as providers. Their own attitudes and emotions were changed, allowing them to reassess their own problems and better cope with their own adversities in their lives. And so the main finding from that is that trauma work does have a positive impact on those who provide it, and that can be strengthened by bringing a conscious attention to it. And this, for me, honestly, is what brings me back to this work, because I have never been more inspired than seeing the way that my clients are able to overcome things that I could not even imagine going through, and just the absolute strength and resilience of the human spirit. I had the most beautiful conversation a few weeks ago with a former client of mine who was also a survivor of intimate partner violence. She is also a provider, non-legal provider, but we had this incredible conversation because she was just granted her green card, and it was like one of the most amazing messages I'd ever received in my life. And so we had this phone call where we talked about what our experiences have done for how we approach our work, and how it makes it hard, but also how it makes it incredibly meaningful to be able to help other people who have gone through similar things. And it was so touching. She talked about how she was working with a woman in the context of her work who had disclosed she was in an intimate partner violence situation. And she, meaning my former client, had recommended to this woman the same book that I recommended to her when we were working together. And her client, after reading it, they decided to start making a safety plan together to help her leave that situation. And I thought that was the most beautiful example of paying it forward and vicarious resilience that I could possibly imagine. And that, for me, is why this work is so meaningful, and why it is so worth it to take the time to learn about trauma and to incorporate this into our day-to-day practice. So 4 minutes over. I thank you for everybody who was able to stay on. I know that this is late on a Thursday night, but sincerely, I'm so grateful for all of you and for being willing to take time out of your very busy lives to talk about this and to have this at the forefront. And I genuinely hope that we can stay in touch. And I have my contact information up on the screen. And if anybody does want to stay on, I'm more than happy to hang out for a little while and chat. I think my partner took care of the dog's meal, so I'm off the hook for right now.
Well, thank you, Kaylee. I feel like you're a one-woman movement to improve the world. I really appreciate all the time that you took and just all that what you give of yourself. So thank you so much. And I think it's just us now, but I think someone asked about materials. So I'll close this and let's talk, or we can talk tomorrow. But thank you so much. This was really great, Kaylee.
And Sheila, I did see somebody ask for the last code, if there is one.
Oh, yep. Let me, it's resilience, actually. I'm going to
how appropriate.
Isn't Tom of the CBA really great? It's resilience. So I'll put that in there. I don't know how you saw that. You're so good.
I had the question and answer open. I have a lot of things going on my screen, but I was able to keep that open and keep an eye on it. So
You're
thank
amazing.
you everybody for the very thoughtful and meaningful questions. And I will hang out in case anybody does want to come off. Actually, can people come off camera?
No, I don't think they can, believe it or not. But okay. I don't know if you want, did you share? Oh, you've got your email there.
Yes,
yeah, and I think I just want to remind people that we will come up with some materials, because I think Kaylee has said that she will post her slides. And I think there was a diagram that I think I got from you, but people were asking for materials that they can submit on behalf of their clients to adjudicators.
Oh, absolutely.
And I know you have a lot of things that you're happy to
I would
share.
be more than happy to put some stuff together. So can certainly do that and get that to you and Stacy maybe sometime next week and like the next week or so.
Great. And to anyone who's still on, if you're volunteering for CAP or doing any of this other work, thank you so much. And thanks for tuning in.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate it. Thanks, Kaylee.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sheila. And thank you, Stacy.
Good night.